Okay, everybody, hello and welcome to the Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I am ready to bring you another great conversation this week. How is your quarantine situation? How was your media diet recently? I've been thinking a lot about media lately. I don't know if I've ever felt the more poisonous element of media's influence on our lives than during this virus moment. I mean, I lived through 9/11. I know a lot of you did too, and I remember how corrosive and poisonous and insane all of that was. If you listen to our bonus episodes, you know that we had a discussion on one of our recent vibe checks about the whole media scroll of breaking news that began on the bottom of the TV screen in the days after 9/11 and really hasn't left us. This notion that we're stuck in a narrative that's being controlled. And that element of it is really, really disturbing to me. And I think it's more important than ever that we kind of step back and get out of that influence and figure out what else is going on, and don't let the virus and the plague and all that news become the kind of dominating mental, emotional reality that you occupy all the time. My guest today is someone who helped me talk about other things and the kind of larger political picture. Her name is Yasmin Nair. We've had her on the show before. She's one of our favorites, a very outspoken, brilliant writer and activist out of Chicago. She always tells you what's on her mind. She had a tweet earlier this morning that I think kind of gets to what I wanted to get to today, which is to kind of not lose sight of the larger kind of political reality we occupy, and to actually keep doing our work. A lot of people have this notion that we're just going to only think about this until it's over, when this is kind of the moment where we have to apply all that kind of political and economic and cultural knowledge that the left is kind of known for, and that thinkers are known for, academics are known for, which is kind of unpacking ideas and figuring them out in the moment. I think historians especially, I come from the history discipline, historians especially kind of pull back from thinking about the larger picture of the moment they're living in because they think we need to live 30 more years before we know what's going on. And I think there's some truth to that. I think that later on we'll be figuring out what this virus meant, and there will be angles on it that none of us can see right now. The story may be, in fact, completely different than the one that we're kind of generating right now. But Yasmin had this great tweet this morning where she says, I think there's an inclination among many of us to think that certain kinds of intellectual work or even professions are now irrelevant or should be on hold till after. Listen, after may never be here. More importantly, you cannot let this stunt our collective will to think. And so I really appreciate that from Yasmin. She's someone who always is providing a refreshing angle on things. I know she pisses a lot of people off with her takes, which is wonderful for the Nostalgia Trap, because I love to hear what she has to say. We talk about stuff like the Bernie Sanders campaign, Me Too, prison abolition, Harvey Weinstein, all that kind of stuff in this conversation, in part because that stuff is absolutely inseparable from the moment we're in right now. Like, we can't not talk about prison abolition when we're talking about dealing with the virus. We can't not talk about sexuality and trans issues and race when we're talking about the virus, because all of that knowledge is going to help us unpack this situation and move forward with into the world that we want to inhabit. So enjoy this conversation with Yasmin Nair. She's and go check out all of her stuff. I find that following her on Facebook and Twitter has been the best way to access all of her writing, and she's got a great website that she tells us about too. So check out all her stuff, and if you like what we do on the Nostalgia Trap, go check out our Patreon. We've been doing a lot more deep conversations with Justin Rogers Cooper and bonus episodes, weekly vibe checks. So if you're a subscriber, you kind of enter into this other world of the Nostalgia Trap where we kind of talk more about current events, what's happening, or what we anticipate may happen, and giving a little bit of historical and political and cultural context to all of it. So if that's your jam and you want to support our show, which we could certainly use during these trying times, go over to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and join our club. We're having fun over there, and I really appreciate hearing from all of the subscribers, and we've gotten a lot of new subscribers lately. I think many people want to hear our takes, and particularly Justin Rogers Cooper's takes on what's happening. So thank you to all the people who are joining and the new subscribers, because we love building this little community and hearing from you and finding that there are many more people that feel the same way we do. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Here is me talking with the one and only Yasmin Nair. Yeah. So, I mean, it's always fun to talk to you, Yasmin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always my pleasure. Thank you, David.
Yeah, I mean, it's really one of those moments always. I feel like this whole year will be, 2020 will be a year where you could unpack a million things going on at once. There are a confluence of events, but I don't know. I mean, one of the places I wanted to start with you because you're someone who, I think of you as an interdisciplinary person, someone who comments on a wide range of different phenomenon.
Right.
And I'm thinking about. I mean, I think everyone's thinking about the presidential primary right now, and I'll just give you my rant and see if you identify with this or think it's right or wrong. But I suspect you'll agree with some of it. But like, I don't know. It feels like as a person on the left, like the election years really suck because they just kind of it sucks up all the energy in the room, and you end up like having a conversation about like one guy. And that part of it and the president, like the office of the presidency. And it seems like I don't know, it just kind of like almost like the entire left just loses its mind and gets derailed every 4 years around a presidential election rather than kind of like keeping an eye on the wider prize, if that makes sense.
Yes. No, I agree with you. No, I was just, I think just before we started talking, I think we said, it's been a day. I mean, forget the year, just today alone.
Yeah.
It's been so fraught. And I completely agree with you. And I was just sort of trying to, just before I got on here, I was having these online conversations with people about prison, and because besides the election, the big news today, and we should say, of course, that we are talking the day after the Tuesday primary, where it has apparently been decided by many that Bernie Sanders' campaign is over.
Yeah.
But we're also talking on the day of the announcement that Harvey Weinstein has been sentenced to 23 years in prison. So I've been having these conversations about what prison abolition should look like and vengeance and all of that. So it's been, I think the left is. The left is such a fuck up. I don't say that often, but one thing that occurs to me is just before while I was prepping for this, I was thinking in 2016, and please pull me back if you think I'm not addressing what you raised. I think we're both thinking about a lot of things today, and especially in the last hours. So do pull me back, please. But one of the things that occurred to me is that in 2016, no one thought, well, some of us did, but no one, in a sense, thought that Trump could win. And in 2020, no one thinks that Trump could lose.
Right.
And I find, right, so that period of 4 years and the drastic shifts that have come about, and even the drastic shifts that have come about, even just the last 2 weeks. So remember, David, just I think 2 weeks ago, a lot of people thought that Sanders was unbeatable and Biden was, just about to flame out in some old sort of TV style where he would forget his own name or something. And now it seems the other way. I don't advocate for individual candidates or sort of support people in general during elections, because it allows me to kind of keep thinking about the big issues around them. And the thing that struck me about Sanders and the left in general is how a lot of the electioneering and campaigning starts with this sentiment that we have to get this racist, sexist xenophobe out of office. Right. And I think that's a terrible logic. That's not the logic on which people are going to vote. I was telling a friend of mine the other day, I said, look, if I would walk out of my house in Hyde Park, which despite being a majority black neighborhood in Chicago, and where I still face racism every single day in one way or the other, if I were to walk out of the house and someone came up to me and said, vote for me because I will end racism and I'll get, and I'll end sexism, I would say, fuck you and move on. Because that is not, because I am dealing with racism we deal with racism and sexism in our everyday lives in different structural ways. And we think about ending them in different structural ways than what elections and presidents and senators can give us. So when a politician comes to me, my attitude is going to be, you need to fix healthcare. You need to fix the jobs problem. You need to fix the fact that as a writer, I'm never guaranteed that I'll even be paid on time. I'm never guaranteed. No one thinks that writers should have anything remotely, like a livable wage, for instance, because they think of it. So I guess my point is simply that I think the biggest mistake that the left is making is to turn this election, or is to just look at the times we live in right now as something to do with ending issues that are not what politicians can really fix.
Yeah.
Sanders is not, I know he keeps saying this, but I want to look at Sanders and go, you're not going to be able to fix racism and sexism and misogyny and all of that. What you can do is start to end this prison industrial complex, for instance. Mm-hmm. What you can do is force the immigration rights movement to actually come up with a fucking agenda for a change, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. What you can do is to make sure not only that everyone has more than a quote unquote living wage, right? But also make sure that women have childcare, right? That women there are these other institutional structural things that you can take care of that will move towards people gaining parity and power in their lives, right?
Yeah.
I don't need you to fix Trump's homophobia or get him out because of his homophobia. I need you to him out because of the ruination that he is causing, but also the ruination that has been built on the backs of people, that was built by people like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, right? So that's where I think the left is failing constantly. It's falling into this trap. So every time I have conversations around Trump, people start to say, well, I think he's disgusting. I think he's awful. And they start to stop talking about the structural economic issues, and they just start talking about what a horrible person he is. As if somehow getting a good person in office, whatever that means, is somehow going to solve the problem. And I think the left, even though this is where you might expect to have really astute political and economic analysis, the left is constantly in that sort of rut of this is about racism and sexism. I remember when, one of the elections, Stacey, good God, please edit this so that I don't come across as quite
Stacey Abrams?
Yeah, Stacey Abrams, thank you. And I was watching Democracy Now! And one of the things I remember Amy Goodman saying is, her opponent is attempting to end the election, is trying to make sure that a black woman doesn't get elected. And I watched that and I thought, no, he's not. He's a Republican trying to make sure that a Democrat doesn't get elected.
Right.
He's a Republican trying to make sure that he gets elected. Now, is it possible that he hates black women and all black people? Quite certainly. But that's not his position. Right? That's not where he's coming from. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You were saying.
Yeah. No, I was just, I recognize all that. And it's weird because that I think that's kind of the mainstream, almost centrist conversation is a lot around kind of personality and what makes people feel good. And a lot of people, and I include even the moderate Republicans that have moved over to the Democratic Party now, they love Obama because he made them feel good and he seemed like a good person to them. And I don't know if you've seen the whole fucking industry of like Obama memorabilia and things like that. But it's kind of unbelievable. I here in Southern California, there are a lot of rich white liberals who just eat this shit up. You can even see it in Barnes and Noble. All these official photo books of Obama and his family, and they're just it's like a weird fetish. And that part of it is, I hear a lot of older people, especially because I teach courses with older population, or as I should say, use the proper terminology, they're a mature population.
Right.
But either way, they hate Trump. But what they always bring up is kind of how personally boorish he is. They're kind of like yesterday, a lot of them were talking about how he can't spell and his tweets are misspelled and he can't speak correctly. And it would be so nice to have a president that has a proper control of English grammar, let alone all the like racist assumptions within that. But either way,
right.
What's fucked up about it to me is like, listening to you and hearing that, I feel like the left, as much as they want to like say, no, we're getting away from that and we're like going to like structural issues and things like that. There is a kind of idea that Bernie is like the better guy. There's like a fetish of him too, which is like he may be, he may have a pure, more clean soul than the rest of us. But either way, it seems like there's a fetish around that too, that like we'll get this one good guy into this corrupt, rotten structure, and somehow that one guy will improve things. In other words, it really kind of drowns out a more complicated conversation we could be having.
Exactly. It drowns out a more complicated conversation, and it also prevents them, and I think Sanders, right, from strategizing how to win. So I'm thinking about South Carolina. And right before that primary, I remember tweeting and saying, these guys are going into this thinking about black voters in South Carolina as some kind of salty, people of the earth who will definitely look at Bernie Sanders and say, aha, of course we'll vote for Bernie Sanders and not Joe Biden. And I remember thinking, this is just wrong, because there's also, I think, that racism, let's just call it that, right? There's a kind of racist fetishization of there's a weirdness around the working class idea, and then there's a weirdness around what black voters are like. And the last time, as you remember, I think we've had a conversation about this, the racist left just exploded after 2016, claiming, of course, that it was white working class and it was black people who had voted all wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And they kept calling, the term WWC came up, right? White working class, as if somehow working class people are, defined in the sort of 1950s, Marlon Brando film style of these white guys in sleeveless t-shirts running around. So there is, it was so bizarre. I remember thinking, this is really weird, because black voters in a state like South Carolina, that's a complex entity that none of you seem to have any idea about. And as a friend of mine, Allison, pointed out on Twitter, actually a couple of days ago, she said, Boeing, I believe, right, went to South Carolina precisely because it's so anti-union. The anti-union, so there was that. And of course, we saw what happened. And Sanders, I believe, I think he didn't even go to Mississippi this time around, right? I
don't think so. He got like less than 3% of the black vote of people over 60. And I actually saw like just the most obnoxious, like liberal centrists kind of gloating over that, using the same exact kind of fetish and racism. They were saying like, leave it to the old wise black people to cleanse our culture. It's always up to them. And I'm like, what the fuck is that about? It's so gross.
It's disgusting. And it also points to the fact that the Sanders campaign hasn't really figured out, even though it has all these young black voters, right, that they think are tied to them, it hasn't quite figured out what the black vote really means. And it strikes me that their idea of the black vote is reductive. And doesn't really have, even though they keep talking about intergenerational, they don't really have a sense of cross-generational voting patterns, right? So I don't think they understand how different communities work. And I don't think they understand the complexities of what it means to be, quote unquote, black voting bloc in any part. I mean, you were talking about Obama a minute ago, for instance. So I live in Hyde Park, and yes, there's a great deal of fetishization of Obama in Hyde Park, but there's also a really intense, simmering hatred towards him because of what he's doing with the Obama Presidential Foundation. And the Obama, the foundation has pretty much colluded with the University of Chicago and the city of Chicago to really remake Hyde Park in a completely different image now, and they've been fairly blatant about it. A friend of mine said that she went to a meeting with the Obama Foundation people, and one of them, when the Community Accountability Board people spoke up, one of the foundation people responded, we will not allow your transcendence. Like, in other words, we are transcendent now in this community. You are not allowed to speak back to us, is essentially what they were saying. So Obama, and what I find so interesting is how Obama's constantly evoked, both, by Sanders, by Warren, by Biden, all of them, as if he's some god floating above them. And that, I think, has, yes, absolutely, as you pointed, has a lot to do with the fetishization of blackness. And I think in many ways that's perhaps, since we're talking about the left, I think that's where sort of the progressive left wing of whatever it is, that I feel like in the US, race never escapes that weirdly fetishistic space, right? That you either demonize someone or you fetishize them to a great extent, and create, magical Negroes, for instance, in this case, or what you were quoting, someone's talking about the wisdom of Black elders or whatever. I think one of the problems here is the intractability of race in the US. I don't know if that's getting any better. Yeah. Maybe on an individual social level, perhaps. I walk around Chicago, and I remember from, when I moved here in 97, I see more interracial, not just interracial relationships, sexual or romantic relationships, but more interracial friendships even. That's actually very uncommon in Chicago even. And I see more of that. So maybe on a personal level, things are changing, but not in a way that is helpful to us politically. And then, I don't know. And then you get, I
was just thinking there about Chicago, and the presidential library and everything like that becoming almost like, that you see Obama as a literal like force of gentrification and like a force of capital, like within Chicago. And it seems like, isn't Rahm Emanuel pretty well hated in Chicago?
Loathed.
Yeah. And so I wonder what that balance is, because there's both like, you can invoke Obama as this god, but at the same time, it seems like there's a growing awareness that like the god might be phony or that it might like be a devil in God's clothing or something like that. In other words, like aligned with the police, aligned with the very forces that are like destroying the city. Definitely
destroying the city. And I've always said that Obama is our last non-millionaire president we'll ever see, I think. Because think about it. The Clintons came in, Bush came from money. The Clintons came in and made out like bandits, right? Like they left. And I feel like the presidency nowadays has become a paid internship.
Yeah.
You go in, right? You go in to be president, and you're going to come out of it with amazing book deals and business deals. And that's what the Obamas are doing. The Obamas are also making out. They are multimillionaires at this point. They've got Netflix deals up the wazoo. They're now getting into entertainment. They're getting into books. They're getting into real estate. And all of this had to have this didn't just happen the day after he left office, right? I think these were all deals that were being constructed while he was in office. Yes, of course, I'll let you have this. I'll pat your back. I'll scratch your back now. You'll do the same for me when I leave office. And it's now a lucrative enterprise for him. But he's also he didn't come in with money. He's the last person who didn't come in with money. I don't think it's ever going to be the case again. I don't know what Biden's financials are, but Biden's not exactly sort of incorruptible himself, right? So it's become a paid internship that has nothing to do with actually getting things like healthcare, which Biden has by now, stood against quite strenuously, right? He's going to veto. So it's an internship, in effect. It's a grand international, the most powerful internship, the only model for a paid internship that we have these days.
And that's a conversation that I feel like the left that gets sucked into the Bernie orbit just doesn't want to have. They don't want to have a conversation about like what the executive has become in the years since World War II, in which the executive has expanded to the point where it just kind of like can throw bombs around the whole world and have, you know, no accountability for that, and just how anti-democratic all of that has become. God, when I think of the Netflix Obama shit, it's just kind of like, that's the answer. Like, the guy does not become a crusader for anything beyond like making a lot of money. And I don't know if you've seen any of that Netflix shit, but I think I watched a trailer for one of them, and you talk about white working class. They had like, they have, I mean, it's kind of bizarre. I mean, it's unbelievable, actually. It's like Obama and Michelle dressed in their kind of Sunday clothes, you know, they're more casual, but they're sitting at they're sitting at the kitchen table of like this white, what you talk about, what WWC, like a white working class couple who's telling stories about how their parents worked in factories, and even though they worked in factories, they got a decent life out of that, and they're looking for that today. And in other words, they're nailing down a really specific narrative, and it's kind of fucking bizarre to watch, because it's like, that's what our politics have become. When you say like the presidency as a paid internship, it really resonates with that. It feels like the politics are celebrity politics, and that part of it is, it leads to, I think, you know, what you said earlier, which is amazing, you know, to point out that everyone thought Trump couldn't win. I mean, everybody. Everyone I was listening to, from Corey Robin to Jacobin to, you know, every kind of leftist, were saying Hillary's going to win, and that was the narrative, was that neoliberalism and the triumph of Hillary Clinton was unstoppable. And there were very few people. I think actually Michael Moore might have been one of the only like prominent people out there who was saying, no, Trump's going to fucking win. And he does, and that's amazing. I didn't really think about that now the conventional wisdom is Trump is unbeatable. Like, he cannot possibly lose. And that's kind of to me, demonstrates that nobody knows anything.
Exactly. Nobody knows anything. What's interesting about Michael Moore, and I also felt the same way, but I wasn't able to articulate myself, besides the fact that I'm not Michael Moore, but I wasn't able to quite say it out loud, because so many of the people I trusted, you know, political commentators, were saying, yes, Hillary Clinton will win. And not only that, she'll win handily. But I think the reason that I was pretty sure that Trump would win, and I think why also Michael Moore, who's from Flint, Michigan, right?
That's right.
Also knew that is because we've both lived outside of a certain block of Brooklyn for a long time. I'm a Midwestern gal, you know. I know Indiana, I know Illinois. Well, I don't know Illinois so much. You know, I know Chicago certainly, and Chicago's not Illinois, first of all.
Right.
But you know, but I think Moore understood what would happen, because Moore also, you know, as a filmmaker, as a documentarian, he spends all his time traveling around the actual country, talking to people, and he understands what people's anxieties are. And I felt the same way. You know, I sort of grew up really, you know, in Lafayette, Indiana. I mean, yes, I went there when I was about 24, 25, but that's kind of where I grew up in a way, you know, where I became a political adult, as it were. And, you know, Lafayette, Indiana depended at the time. I haven't checked up on how things are right now, but at the time, the Subaru factory was the biggest employer alongside the university. Those are pretty tenuous economic conditions.
Yeah.
And there was a huge divide between, you know, as often there is, between the townies and the university folk. And there were big class disparities, and there were all kinds of simmering resentments, which often materialized as, for instance, you know, racist resentments towards all these Asian students, all these foreigners who were there, etc. But, you know, it was a severely depressed economy, you know, Rust Belt, all of that. It has been a depressed economy for a long time. And people aren't really able, I don't think the left is really able to account for the massive complexity of all of what's happening there. And I think, for instance, you know, when they talk about the working class in the Midwest, there's a failure to comprehend that, for instance, even towns like Lafayette, for instance, many towns across Indiana and other parts of the Midwest are actually have significant populations of Latinx workers. the economies have shifted. They're not the migrant workers, but they're also communities. The communities have shifted. There's a whole other complexion, literally and metaphorically, to to the working class, as it were. And that brings up completely different issues. So I thought, for instance, the Nevada election was really interesting for that reason, and the way, for instance, that the restaurant unions members, right, actually went against the restaurant unions. I forget what the union is called, but they actually went against the
culinary workers union.
The culinary,
yeah,
exactly. That the workers actually went against what the union was telling them to do, because they recognized that they felt solidarity not just with their fellow workers, but with their families outside the union, and their whole attitude was, this has to be something that affects all of us, right? And so that was unique, and that was a point where I think the Sanders campaign did really well. And they had targeted, that their central message went across. But that was also very specific to Nevada, and you have to have that kind of specific. If you're going to go against the Goliath, that is the DNC, which already has a built-in messaging machine, which can project all these sort of very universalized messages. This is what America needs. America needs experience and stability, even if he's this guy who can't remember who's his wife and who's his sister. We need stability, all of that. The DNC is really good at propelling that massive universalizing message. So what I think Sanders had to do was to do what they did in Nevada really well, right? Which was to go in and be very targeted and say, this is what matters to you here. This is what we will bring you. Instead, I think what the big mistake that they did was to think that they could do what the DNC did and to bring about this, again, their universalizing message, which is, we're going to end homophobia, racism, misogyny. We're going to get this guy out. And then we're going to talk about, that ancillary, secondary to that were all the very good reasons that he gives around healthcare, around the prison complex, all of that. But what they've done is to make that message of ending or rather getting rid of Trump, they made that their primary message. And they needed to not do that. They needed to go into every state with a unique message, which is a lot more work.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't think they were lacking in resources for that, especially if they had asked their supporters for that kind of resource, right?
Well, and that wasn't that the lesson supposedly of the 2016 election, was like instantly people were doing their postmortems, and it's amazing how all these people who were experts who were completely wrong are just the next day literally just deleting their old tweets and getting right back in and telling us how shit works, which was fucking incredible. I mean, not just the New York Times. I mean, some of the biggest left commentators who were saying this was all about Hillary's going to win no matter what because she has the institutional power, etc. They were just fucking wrong. But the next day, they're telling you again the diagnosis. And like a lot of that conventional wisdom that emerged, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but it was that Hillary Clinton and their team didn't go into the right states and didn't speak to the states that Trump just fucking ran over. And that part of it started that conversation about the white working class, etc.
Yes.
But part of it, and I think they missed the point there. But either way, the point was that Hillary didn't go to places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and places where she needed to really communicate a specific message. I think you're really, I mean, the Nevada caucus thing seems significant because when you have the union saying one thing and their rank and file going against them, it's kind of like, okay, well, that's what needs to happen. But how do you fucking do that in every state? And how do you talk past? Because it's really like the unions, that's a whole other conversation is unions.
Yes.
And like there's this, the left seems to fetishize unions a lot.
Oh, God, yes.
Despite the fact that unions have fucked me over and fucked my family over many times. Because, unions are to use the parlance of our times, the problematic institutions. But either way, they have power, right? And they're the ones that need to deliver the votes. But it's kind of incredible to see the rank and file, the culinary workers, just be like, nope, we're voting for Bernie.
Yep.
And that seems like, I don't know, it seems like that's the pattern that needs to emerge on the left. And that's something that, like you mentioned, is something that's regional and regionally specific, culturally specific, etc. It seems like a much harder thing than just saying like, Bernie's the guy for everybody, and that's that.
Right. Yeah, the left is really bad with regionalism. And I think it sort of thinks about regionalism as being somehow, insular or it also, I think, has a sort of snobbish attitude about regional matters. It sort of, I think it wants to make regions kind of jump to some sort of weird universal concept of what the left is. And there's so much there that's a problem. I mean, even when you think about, and sorry to keep jumping around, but it just occurs to me that a lot of that has to do with also where media is and who owns media, right? And who runs newspapers and the decline in local reporting, for instance, or at least that local reporting is struggling. And I think if the left, quote unquote, the left had any sense at all, it would start to generate, ways to think about how we are transmitting information and knowledge on very sort of universalized ideas about what constitutes a left, for instance. I mean, publishing alone, right? The world of publishing alone is increasingly dominated by people who can afford to work for very little or free. As you know, I've written about this and talked about this endlessly, and no one seems to listen to me when I say this. I'm like, y'all got to stop doing this, right? Why are you writing for $50 for an entity that has, say, $500,000 apparently that is sitting on? Right. We won't say the name Jacobin.
Honestly, you and I were outliers in talking about Jacobin not paying people, but I think that became a much more widely known thing in the years since. Yes. They're just kind of one example of this kind of industry of the left that's gotten bigger in the last few years. There's, I call it the new left or whatever. People call it the Brooklyn left, and I know it's not all in Brooklyn, but either way, I mean, and some of these publications are better than others for sure. In both their tone and their business practices, if you want to call it that. But either way, it's weird because it's. You're old enough and I'm old enough to remember a different left, like one that was a little closer to home. I feel like the left that I looked at when I was young was, finding little underground newspapers and finding little pamphlets and zines and stuff that felt a little more homemade. And, I don't know what's gained and lost, but it seems like there's a lot gained and lost when we become these kind of like bigger projects, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I think what you're referring to is a kind of intellectual consolidation, right? Yeah. There's a kind of intellectual consolidation in the sense that now, if you want to think of yourself as someone who thinks on the left, these are the views you must have. These very particular views. And I'm thinking here about, if you think about questions around, publishing, for instance, or thinking about consolidation and intellectual consolidation. I think one example where sort of the left was either silent or complicit is in this recent fracas around a novel called American Dirt.
Yes.
So what I will, because I'm actually writing 2 articles about this, what I will say very quickly is that American Dirt was vilified by many people actually on the left, who immediately took it as, sort of some sort of an anti-racist, anti-immigrant stance to say that American Dirt was a horrible novel that trafficked in stereotypes about the U.S. as the savior of brown people, that it, had terrible representations of Mexicans and so on and so forth. Well, I am among perhaps the 15 people who's actually read the goddamn thing. And I can tell you that it's actually a pretty good novel. And it does the opposite of what all these critics, none of whom have actually read the damn novel, right, have been saying. But the reason I talk about that in terms of a consolidation of leftist thought is that people were just relentless about this. Oh, this is a terrible novel and we must ban it and we must, practically burn it and none of you should even buy it. People were saying you shouldn't even buy it. But the consolidation of thought was, there was a consensus formed without really being based in any actual understanding of the actual bloody novel, which, by the way, I will be explicating in great detail.
Beautiful.
but it's ridiculous that no. So, for instance, on Twitter, for instance, someone, not that I want to make, Twitter battles seem more important than they are, but there was this one person who wrote to me saying, well, she claims, she hid her she hid the fact that she didn't talk about the fact that she has a Puerto Rican grandmother. And I said, well, actually, she writes about that in the afterword in the novel. If you had read the novel, you would know that. She does bring up her Puerto Rican grandmother. Then the argument back to me was, well, she does it after the fact. And I said, no, she does it in the novel. I just told you that.
As if there's this like proper way to perform for people, right? And that race and class are something that are performed in even the proper order. And if not, then there's been some grievous offense, and that allows people to score a kind of point, whether it be in the media or otherwise. Yeah, that part of it is ridiculous. And I'm also thinking about, like, I don't know, I like the idea of intellectual consolidation. Another term for that might be groupthink. But the idea that, they're just a lot of these left organizations, even like, major podcasts, I would say, that have become really, really popular, have a kind of like line. And if you deviate from that line, you're like not accepted into the group anymore. In other words, like the social cohesion of the group depends upon everyone agreeing on certain foundational truths. And like for me, like a big one for whatever this kind of Brooklyn left is or whatever, is a kind of assumption of almost like a DSA style, materialism that's just literally like material politics. Let's get away from identity politics and let's get to material politics. And whenever I hear that, there are so many assumptions built into that, and I love the fact, I love talking to you because you're someone who doesn't fall into that groupthink thing. You're like always kind of got the bullshit detector on and thinking like, wait a second, like there are a lot of assumptions in saying that we have to get back to quote unquote material politics because. I don't know if there's such a thing that's called material politics that's separate from all the other stuff.
Race is a material reality.
There you go. Right. And like, they hate, like one of the things that that left industry hates is like discussion of like bodies. They hate the body discourse that comes out of the academy. And to me, I'm like, well, I get the kind of how obnoxious some of that shit gets. But like what you're saying about race as a material reality is one that I think, is an important element to understanding how shit works. And like that part of it is like why these groups are always going to be surprised when things don't go their way.
Right, exactly. Race is a material reality, and that's why race is a material reality, as is gender, as is sexuality, as is any kind of sexual identity. Those are not things that people can leave behind. And those work at very complex intersections of quote unquote privilege and not having privilege. You lose privilege, you gain privilege. You have privilege in certain contexts, but not in others. And I think that's the other problem that people don't understand, for instance, about something like privilege. So I, for instance, have an enormous amount of privilege in that, I know because of my class background, I know how to navigate certain situations, right? And if I'm in a sticky situation, I know how to talk my way out of it very often, But there are also situations where I have absolutely no, to use a Hindi word, no patta, no cachet whatsoever. And I'm stuck sort of, I have no money, for instance, right? So there are situations where money really matters, like groceries or, or cat food. I don't have cats anymore, but, so the privilege is, so I have class privilege, but I also don't have class privilege in some ways, right?
Yeah.
So that's a sticky thing. Whereas someone else who might have money might not have access to class privilege, right? Because that class privilege means that you know how to do certain things without having to hunt for how to do, the way to do certain things. I mean, I was talking to someone about Elton John, and for some reason we were talking about Elton John. I can't remember why, but they said something like, well, Elton John has this attitude towards marriage and money because he doesn't come from money. And I said, yes, but he has lots of money in terms of he has tons of money. He has actual money, right? Yes. Whereas in England, there are these lords and ladies who cling, tenaciously to their titles because that's all they have left in the world. They've got castles, but they can't keep up the damn castles. So they have to have tourists trooping in and out every day to keep the castle up, right? But they've got no actual money, right?
Yeah.
So you get someone like Elton John who has a title and money, then you get someone who has a much older title and absolutely no money. And then what happens is, class privilege then gets really complicated in that sense, right? So, and there are situations where Elton John will feel snubbed precisely because he doesn't come from old titles. So class also works very differently. I was trying to explain to someone else the other day during discussion that class and race work very differently in the UK than they do in the US, for instance, or in Canada. There are patterns of migration that are very different, where migrant communities have different kinds of privilege and class. The point of saying all of this is to say that I think the problem on the left is that it's not that the left needs to have a substantive understanding about every single kind of situation or situational issue or problem around class and race and all of that. It's that it doesn't really have an intellectual sort of, what would we call it? It doesn't have the intellectual heft or the desire or really a template for understanding and absorbing how these complexities work. And then that's why I think the left doesn't really know how to organize particularly well, right? Yeah. So it can organize well again, I'm thinking about Nevada and how gorgeous that was. And then I think about, South Carolina, how that just blew up, right? You had sort of the old guard leaders, for instance, standing behind Biden. The inroads needed to be made into that old guard long before the primary. Those conversations needed to happen. I mean, that's one of the first lessons I learned as an organizer, even when I was just working as a lecturer rep at UIC. That's all I was. But I went to one of my mentors, who was a wonderful Sonia Michelle, maybe I shouldn't name her because I don't know if she'd want to be associated with me anymore. People have this problem with me. But she was one of my early mentors when I was, I was a lecturer and I was a lecturer representative at UIC in the English department. And I went to her and I said, how do you get people to do what you want them to do, right? Like how do you organize people? And what she told me based on, her years of organizing as a grad student and as a women's studies scholar at Harvard years ago, she said, what you do is what my mentor did, which is you go to every single person and you have a conversation. And she said they needed to get gender and women's studies passed as a discipline, and all these white men were completely against it. And the woman who was spearheading the effort went around, spoke to every single one of them. Every single one of them, had long conversations with every single one of them. And on the day of the vote, every one of them voted for it to go through, except one old white guy who sat in the corner and said, never, never, never.
Well, fuck that guy. There's always going to be that guy.
Fuck that guy. He was one, right?
You know what you're making me, you're making me think of about how hard organizing is I'm sitting here looking over at my bookshelf and I'm looking at Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson, which I haven't read. I've read pieces of it. I don't think anyone ever reads an entire Robert Caro book.
No one reads the Carol.
They're thousands of pages long. But one of the main, but there's gold on every page. And one of the main lessons that I learned about Lyndon Johnson is that Johnson never really was good with crowds at all. He actually talked to people individually. They're like, he never talked to more than, and he was a total as a result, he was kind of like a cipher. He was someone who was like a different person to everybody. Like some people experienced like him as like this kind of backwards redneck racist, whereas other people kind of experience him as this highly refined, civilized Washington insider. And he would play those roles to different people. And they said he never met with anybody besides just one-on-one. And that's how he built coalitions was everybody in the room had met with him and trusted him, but that allowed him to kind of have real power. And that's what the book is about. It's about power. And that's something that I don't think is part of the conversation now. It just feels like, well, get people to listen to Bernie Sanders talk about material kind of politics and that's it. They'll respond to that when you're instead talking to an enormously diverse group of people depending on where you are.
I'm so glad you brought up the P word, power.
Yeah.
I mean, that the left does not want to talk about power because it wants to pretend that power should not affect anything. Whereas in fact, it's fine. You need to, given the world where we're living in, right, which is not a Star Trek utopia, You need power, and even then it's all about power, but you need power and you need to know how to get it, and you need to know how. Basically, what your elected reps should do is to make things happen for you. That's what they should be doing for you.
Yeah.
I know the big problem on the left is that we start to think about people like Bernie and AOC and all of these, and even at the local level in Chicago, I see this all the time in elections. People start to think of their lefty progressive candidates as their friends.
Yeah.
And that is first of all, such a fucking big mistake, because you're just doomed to heartbreak. And secondly, that's not about a long-term vision of power. You're not going to get power that way. I was just saying the other day that in my lifetime, I do think it's possible in my lifetime to get, for instance, as president, a young, black, queer, punk, ex-con, quote unquote. I think that is actually entirely possible, but it's entirely impossible if we go about it the way the Sanders campaign has been going about it. And the reason I say that is because, okay, again, to bring up very, very tiny situations, right, where I ran for election twice on sort of the grad level and then the level.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was like the only one color at the time, I was openly out at one point, not in the other way, and I got fucking elected. And I'm saying this is a totally different scale. It's infinitesimal, right, in comparison to national, local. By the way, I've also been asked to run as alderperson and all of that, right? So it's not like, so what I'm trying to say is that people do think of me, right? I don't want to be in politics, but people do think of me as a viable political candidate. And I do think that I could win. Because it isn't about going into a race and saying, oh my God, everyone's racist, or as Elizabeth Warren keeps saying, everyone's, I couldn't win because of misogyny. I'm like, no. You can win no matter who you are. But it is exactly about what we've just been talking about, which is, do you know how to enlist people in your vision? You have to enlist them, which means that you have to talk to them, which means that you don't dumb things down, but you convey to them that who they are matters. But you also make it clear to them that who they are matters, and also that they may not get everything that they want. But they'll get a pretty substantial amount. I think that's the other issue, is to sort of there are ways to make things happen. There are ways to bring about radical visions, right? I mean, we saw it in AOC, for instance. We've seen it in local elections all over. But we don't have that grand vision, I think, of how to make that possible on a larger scale. Because on a larger scale, we're thinking about these big, quote unquote, sort of ideological issues. People are not voting on voting day on ideological issues. They're really voting on, honestly, sometimes they're voting on, as a friend of mine put it, whose name I won't quote because all her tweets are private. As a friend of mine put it, they're voting on how they feel that particular morning sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And if you haven't made yourself important and interesting enough to them before that point in time, you're screwed.
Yeah, I mean,
if you've only been talking about, get Trump out because he's a misogynist, whatever.
Right, that part of it not working, and like also just the vision of kind of like the negative, which is like I'm not Trump, so vote for me, just seems ridiculous. But one of the most effective moments I've seen in the Sanders campaign, and I know we're sitting here like shitting on the whole Sanders campaign, and I think it's important, and I think I voted for Bernie here in California, and I want it to happen, and I kind of am one of those people that has eyes wide open while I'm doing it. Well, I'm kind of like, well, this is one thing that's part of a lot of things. But either way, one of the most effective moments I saw, and I don't know if you've seen something like this, but like the Black Lives Matter organizers that have been surrogates for Bernie have done some of the stuff we're talking about, and like including having like audiences hold hands and squeeze their hands when they've experienced things like being incarcerated for marijuana, or even like feeling suicidal over medical bills, or that kind of stuff seems really, really potent, and seems like a closer path to the kind of thing we're talking about, where like speak to people in a real way. Like don't like talk about this abstract issue of like Trump can't spell and we need someone who can spell in there. That seems like completely useless. We have to talk to people's like real, like you talk about material reality. There it is, but in a much more kind of specific way, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, absolutely, absolutely. The specifics matter to people. The ideology certainly matters, but you can put that up on a friggin' website. They can go to your website to find that, right? What you need is, while you're trying to get them to think about you as a concrete person. And again, yeah, again, this is where materiality actually is not material reality. It's materiality of bodies and people's and lives experiences do matter. I mean, the bad way to go about it is, I think, the way that Warren sometimes did, which was to sort of evoke this weird womanliness. I don't know. We won't even go there.
The bodies
I'm just so annoyed with that shit. Yeah.
The bodies thing. I mean, and I keep coming back to Black Lives Matter because I think that they are an organization that has is kind of modeling something different, and something a little more, I don't know, horizontal, a little more material in that real sense. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement emerged out of like Michael Brown's body like laying in the street, right? And like emerged out of like watching videos of people like, Eric Garner being choked to death by the police. And that feels like it's really visceral. And it's something that Black Lives Matter seems like it's touching on, in part because it emerges out of that outrage that you feel when you see something like that. But also I don't know, it's keyed into something really important. And it seems like, the talk about racism in a very abstract way, like Trump is racist or xenophobic or whatever, seems like it actually gets us away from that like more visceral outrage embedded in something like Black Lives Matter.
Right. And no, absolutely. And here in Chicago, BLM had a similar effect in groups like Asada's Daughters and other groups which organized around Anita Alvarez, and they organized around the shooting of Laquan McDonald,
That's
16
right.
shots. So for 16 days, it was an amazing campaign. For 16 days, they dropped 16 banners, one each day. And it was fantastic. And Alvarez was completely slated to win. There was no doubt that she was going to win. And boom, like 5 days before, it just began to decline. And we have Kim Fox, who's now actually going to be fighting, I think, a somewhat embattled battle here. But yes, exactly. The lives and bodies matter, and the left has not reconciled itself to that fact because I think the left also sort of has its own self-image of itself as a material, as being really white people. I don't know how else to put it.
No, totally.
Whose aspirations are somehow apparently seen as rather different from that of anyone else. And there's just a lot of racism on the left, frankly. There's a lot of racism and there's a lot of sexism, which we can't even get into today. But the left has its own problems.
I wanted to just ask you about that because we started out talking about it, we didn't get to it. But the Weinstein thing seems like a important moment, and it's one that kind of I think gets at a little bit of how complicated this is, because the hashtag Me Too movement seems like it's and I'll offend people with this, but it seems like it's very like for rich white women kind of thing, and especially in its kind of like its public face, if that makes sense. But so watching Weinstein be sentenced today. And seeing like Gloria Allred kind of out there like celebrating this 23-year prison sentence, it kind of brings up a lot of the complexities of what we're talking about here, because it's like it isn't this like the same carceral feminism that we've seen before.
Absolutely, and it's actually, I think in some ways it's getting even more, if possible, it's getting more carceral, it's getting more toxic, it's getting more venomous. There's a kind of weird, it's like watching a mob intensifying, it's like watching a mob attracting more and more people. There is nothing good that I see coming out of this, really. I mean, I think awareness about sexual assault has been something that women in service industries have put up with for eons.
Yes.
Right? So it became, and I'm not saying that it is completely unimportant, but Me Too became an issue because suddenly we thought, oh wait, all these like rich white women like Angelina Jolie and Jennifer Aniston and all these other people are talking about having been groped or having been sexually harassed, and suddenly that became important. And the horrific intensity of hatred towards Weinstein today, as he's sentenced to 23 years, and also the wish by many people that he be subjected to exactly the same kind of sexual exploitation and humiliation and deprivation that many of them have complained about.
Yeah, there's a lot of jokes about him being raped in prison and how he's getting what he deserves and everything like that. I mean, I understand the anger, and as someone who has seen how you want to talk about power. It seems like Weinstein is a good example of how power works, which is, these types of pigs exist in every institution. Like it's almost like a hallmark of institutional power is some sort of sexual element. And I think that's the kind of larger thing we're missing here, which is that kind of there's a structural element that produces people like Weinstein. And I almost feel like, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I almost feel like a lot of like when the Women's March happened, and like a lot of this is going back to what you're saying about like Trump and like people hating Trump because he's gross and he's disgusting and he's, a sexual groper and all those sorts of things. And it felt like, well, we can't get him on the Russia shit. So like we're going to try to like be carceral and really hard on the kind of like people in power that we can grab. I mean, I'm happy that Weinstein has been exposed and things like that. But I agree with you in the sense of like, if you're a prison abolitionist, you have to recognize that there is ugliness that is being aimed at Weinstein. That's really the ugliness that's mainly aimed at people of color and poor people every day. And it's them that really suffer the consequences of a society that really embraces that kind of punishment.
Absolutely. Exactly. What we're doing is to make it just as possible to be merciless towards a great number of other people. And it's not that Weinstein should suffer, but what we're trying to say is that alongside him, you're also advocating for violence done to any number of people. And if it matters to you, a lot of them are also, wrongfully accused. A great many people in prison are there for things that they actually have not done, which doesn't mean that we think less, that we think with less rigor about the people who may actually have done things, right? But that if we are going to follow that logic, then we have to understand that this sort of thing affects everyone in prison. And that's a real problem. I mean, and the other, there's so many issues with this Weinstein issue. First of all, I don't think it's going to solve anything in Hollywood at all. I don't think it's going to solve anything. Because as long as you have Hollywood being one of the biggest friggin' exports, being a gigantic money grosser, being an industry where nowadays 300 million is considered a not very significant sum to spend on making a film, right? Yeah. As long as you have a system built on such massive ideas of profit, you are going to have sex being used as a tool. Yeah. That is just the fact of life. And the sex between men and men, between men and women, whatever. Sex is transactional in many economies. Sex is just there's a part of an economy that, it's an economic tool for many people. Yep. So you're not going to get rid of that aspect. And as long as you can't get rid of that, you're not going to get rid of sexual exploitation. I mean, a lot of the cases around Weinstein, even, frankly, were fuzzy. Yes. I mean, I don't think it's improper to question why it is that women were in relationships, how they described it, for years with Weinstein. You can't just say it was Stockholm Syndrome. You can't just say it was about power and his domination. You have to think about the system of power that keeps those kinds of relationships in place, which then allows him to continue, right, to use those kinds of coercive tactics with other women as well. Gloria Allred is the major reason why NDAs are still being enforced these days, because there was actually legislation. If you read the book, She Said, by the two New York Times reporters, Gloria Allred actually was responsible for torpedoing the legislation that would have mitigated or even, I think, ended NDAs, the use of NDAs. It's the use of NDAs, you see, that allows people like Weinstein to continue sexual harassment. Because what happens is, he harasses someone like him harasses someone, his people come in, make the victim sign this NDA, give her a substantial sum, and then he goes on to the next person. And he has said on many occasions, right, he actually has said, my people will take care of this. So Gloria Allred is actually a major reason why we have a system that perpetuates sexual assault. Yeah. And there she is in public waving this horrible sign around about the 23 years that he got, as if somehow she, quote unquote, brought him to justice. So even just, as I look at all of this, right, and I think this whole fucking setup is so fucked up that no one is actually seeing, again, the P word, right? No one is seeing the power structure at play here. You have someone who's deliberately and directly profiting off sexual assault, who is now acting like she brought someone to his knees, right?
Yeah.
And you have everyone fetishizing her as some kind of a hero. She's been in this position, she's Gloria Allred, right? She takes on women causes. It's total bullshit, really. All of it is just complete bullshit. So as long as you have a system that relies upon power, domination, and where people seek power, I think a lot of people go into the industry thinking, if I just put up with this, maybe I'll be in a position of power one day and I can just say no. I think that's what keeps people going, because the friggin' profits are so fucking enormous.
Yeah.
They're unbelievable. The salaries alone, right? If I were paid tomorrow to play Wonder Woman, the amount I get paid to play Wonder Woman will be fine for me for the rest of my life. I'll never need to do another role. I'm fine. Like, I don't need to be jetting around.
That's a trade that people are not prepared to have that conversation. Because it's much easier to kind of see these things, these men especially, as kind of anomalous monsters, and that part of it, that's exactly the Trump conversation, right? It's like, this guy is just this so bad, we got to get rid of him no matter what. I mean, that's what's going to bully even people on the left into voting for Biden. Because they're going to be told, if you don't, this guy is so bad and it's such an individual monster that we have to get rid of him. But if you get rid of Trump and you leave the same system, then it just means you're going to produce another Trump. Like it does. In other words, it doesn't really matter. And that part of it is really, really frustrating, because it's not really coming to terms with exactly the kind of ways that power kind of moves through these systems and what people get out of it. Like, people get things out of it. And that part of it, when I'm thinking about thinking about Uma Thurman, who I love, and Kill Bill and Tarantino and all that kind of stuff, and thinking about how she's someone who speaks out about all this stuff now and actually hasn't really said all that much, but she's someone who knew this about Weinstein for maybe 20 years and kind of let it all happen. I'm wondering, that to me demonstrates something so scary about how it all works, because it really, we're all going to kind of come out of it now and point fingers and feel good about ourselves throwing rocks at Harvey Weinstein. But where the fuck were all of you for 20 years if this means so much? You know what I mean? It's like kind of those trades are real, and it gets back to the materiality and the body and all that kind of stuff we've been talking about. But either way, the idea that people would be bullied into voting for Biden because Trump's such a bad guy is kind of incredible, because to me, putting Joe Biden in there in the White House is not that different from having Trump in there. It's kind of it's kind of the wrong conversation to be having. I mean, he's a groper too. I mean, all the things that you hate about Trump are the things that Joe Biden represents too.
Exactly. And those will probably come out. Trump, after all, remember when he brought in all of Bill Clinton's accusers, right, during one of the debates.
That's right.
And there were 4 of them, right? Yeah, 4 of them were sitting there in the audience as the debate went on. So he doesn't give a damn. He has no shame, as it were. I mean, the other problem I think we have in this conversation when we start to talk about the transactional nature of sex is that it's difficult for us, I think, to have that conversation without worrying that we then fall into the trap of painting women in particularly misogynistic terms, etc.
Sure.
And that is certainly a concern, but I think we still have to have that conversation that sex has for long been a transactional item, and that many of publishing included, writing, publishing, all of these fields that we are all a part of, the art world, academia, for goodness sake, right? Sex has long been transactional between men and men, between men and women. I mean, it's just a transactional element of our lives. And we need to sort of sit down and have a long, hard conversation about that, but we don't want to.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't want to say, when we say transactional, I don't want to, give the impression that there's not, imbalances of power, exploitation, rape, sexual assault, all that stuff is real. Because when I think about Jeffrey Epstein, the girls that are in that situation were treated as I don't know what the transaction was. In other words, like, it's different from Hollywood. You're talking about like a kind of like sex slavery going on. That's a little bit different.
It was and it wasn't. I mean, in one case, for instance, one of them, I think, again, she was clearly just extraordinarily naive about how the world operates. But one of them had been told by Epstein that he could get her into NYU, and I think he did put her in touch.
Right. So there's the exchange is still drawing.
She was an immigrant. Right. So she was, and I think she was an immigrant from somewhere in Europe, and the problem there with the whole trafficking discourse is how, for instance, the feds tend to use it very loosely, and it becomes a way. So with sex trafficking, for instance, if you are a woman who's caught, if you're an immigrant woman who's been caught, say, exchanging sex for money, you have to declare someone as a sex trafficker in order for you to not get deported. That's how the FBI gets inflate these numbers. That's how we have these extraordinarily inflated numbers of sex trafficking. These women are not actually, the image that we have of sex trafficking is of, these often, dark men whipping women and tying them up in basements and so on. And that does occasionally happen, but that's not really the reality of how sex trafficking operates. Sex trafficking is also very much it's a construct. It's a term that's used to actually mobilize people against, for instance, the reality that sex, again, there is such a thing as sex trade, for instance.
Yeah, right.
So it's complicated issues. With Epstein too, if you start looking at the individual cases, you realize a lot of these are vulnerable. It's less that they're trafficked, but they're extraordinarily vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable in their home situations. They're vulnerable in the political situations. They come into the country as temporary maids, for instance, on different kinds of visas. All of those layers of exploitation all get erased under the narrative that the press gives us, which is, all these girls, but young girls were trafficked.
Right.
And which again, as you very rightly point out, and thank you for that, it does not allow us to forget about the violence and the systemic exploitation and all of that did in fact happen. Absolutely.
But maybe it's just because of the nature of the media and the way things work that like something like the Me Too movement just ends up flattening all of these complexities.
Exactly.
And turning the conversation into something about kind of, what it's turned into today, which is seeking retribution through long prison sentences, which, I don't blame it that, I'm not surprised that that's the way it goes. I'm not surprised to see people wanting to see Harvey Weinstein rot in prison, but wanting people to rot in prison seems like an impulse that we ought to address. Because when you talk about like, even the Bernie Sanders campaign, wanting to kind of address the prison industrial complex, it never really talks about it in those terms. It never really gets at the kind of like what we have to do to heal our fucked up minds and fucked up souls that we have so many people in America that have a kind of beyond carceral, they have a punitive attitude towards everything, and that they really like what is it in us that makes us want to see people suffer and want to kind of like have that desire in us. That seems like a pretty profound part of the kind of larger poison that's in the American body, as one kind of thing, and that part of it is something that I know is hard to address. But I don't see it being addressed in the kind of places that it needs to be. And whether you call that the left or whatever, I got into the left in part because I feel that in humanity a lot, and like to me, it felt like the left was a place that actually discusses that and the kind of wanting to come back to some sort of real human values. But it seems like lately the conversation has become just kind of a dry one about universal health care and student loan, canceling student loan debt, which I want both of those things to happen for personal material reasons. But at the same time, we're not really addressing the kind of like how empty we all are, if that makes sense. And that's something that, might be for another conversation. But either way, I had a really fun time talking with you.
No, me too. Thank you. Oh, me too, she said.
That's a great way to end it.
Did I.
Me too.
And I. No. Yes, I think I think we could have a whole other conversation about the very punitive, harsh nature of culture in the U.S. And I don't understand it. And people have often said to me, "Oh well, the Puritans." And I said, "You know what? Let's just be done with that stupid argument. Stop blaming the Puritans for everything, shall we? And let's think about we're the very complex, varied with. Well, I'm always struck by the fact that in the U.S. there's so much tenderness and love, and which I like.
Mm-hmm.
So much tenderness and love for animals.
Yeah.
And the opposite for humans.
Yeah.
And that's a strange conundrum. And I say that as someone who's an animal lover, right? Even though I'm not vegetarian, which my vegetarian friends keep reminding me about.
We're very similar.
Right. Yes. Right. Yeah. So there is that weird conundrum. How we feel about a gorilla that is shot to death because a 3-year-old, wandered into its cage, as opposed to how we feel about many millions of people caged for years.
3-year-olds included.
Yes, 3-year-olds included. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, you're right. The animal thing is really interesting. I think that's a really kind of critical point to explore and think about. Yeah.
Then. Let's talk about animals maybe the next time.
Yeah, I would love to. Well, so besides American Dirt, anything else you're working on? You're always writing and things like that. What's happening in your life?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm working on American Dirt, and I'm working on a piece. I think I'm going to come out and say what it is for a wonderful publication that I'll name afterwards. It's called Black Lives, Brown Guilt, and it is about how the ways in which brown communities in particular reenact white liberal guilt narratives when they try to think about anti-blackness. So I'm writing about that. And actually the most exciting project, which hopefully will be launched, I think in the next week or so, is my new website, which is brand new and completely different from the old one. And it'll have categories that actually work. And it won't look quite like the 1990s version that's up right now. It was very new and sexy, and it was put up for me by a very generous supporter of mine. So that's new. And yes, the piece on American Dirt and Black Lives, Brown Guilt.
Beautiful.
And my new website.
Awesome.
Yes.
Well, your stuff is always fascinating. You always bring an angle that I don't expect, and I think you're honestly one of the most exciting voices out there. So thanks as always for talking with me, and I hope we get to catch up soon.
Yes, animals next time. Thank you so much, David.
Next time,
Always
of course.
A pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Always a pleasure.
All right, huge thank you to Yasmin Nair. I always have a wonderful time talking with her, and it's always fun to hear what she has to say. We want to have her on a few more times this spring because she has lots to say about what's going on with the virus and everything else, and we'll have her back on very soon. Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you for all the people who are supporting the show. If you want to hear more of our takes on what's going on currently, we have new episodes with Justin Rogers Cooper, including a couple that we're putting up later this week. So if you want to listen to those, go over to patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap and become a monthly subscriber. You can cancel at any time. I really appreciate the people who are doing that, and I look forward to hearing more from you very soon. All right, take care, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.